Tales have been told since man first gathered around the fires of prehistory. Tales of the strange and wondrous things hidden in the vast unknown shadows of the world. Tales of creatures divine and beasts demonic, of gods and kings, of myths and monsters. From dark forests to the lands of ice, from desert wastes to the storm-thrashed seas, every corner of the earth has its legends to tell. Stories of heroes and the villains they encounter, of the wilderness and the dangers within. Stories of battles, of love, of order, and of chaos. But what are the roots of these fantastic tales? And why have they endured so long? In this series, we'll explore the history behind these legends and reveal the hidden influences that shaped them. War and disease, religious and social upheaval, the untamable ferocity of the natural world. And above all, the monsters lurking within ourselves. The significance of the wilderness and a journey into it can be hard for us to appreciate. As populations grow and travel and communication become ever faster, we can overlook how different the world was in the past, how vast it must have seemed, and how wild. For thousands of years, most people lived and died within a short distance of the place they were born. Their existence was bounded by the wilderness, by the unyielding darkness of ancient woods, by the ice-shod peaks of impenetrable mountains, and by the hostile desert's lonely wastes. A journey to the next town was a perilous undertaking. It meant abandoning the safe and the familiar, and entering a realm that was not their own.
You confront difference, you confront a world that's not your own, you confront the unknown.
It's dangerous and it's disordered, but it's natural and it's free as well. And this is really, in many ways, the perfect setting for what's going to happen in a myth or a legend.
People will fill the wilderness that surrounds them with what they fear in themselves, what they fear in their own society. The wilderness is the place where we expel all the stuff we don't like in ourselves, in our culture, in our society.
Such is the contradiction of the wilderness. It is both of us and not of us, surrounding us, yet at once strange and far away. For wilderness is as much an idea as it is a physical place, and a great deal can be learned about a people from the way they saw it, and from the stories they told about it. As much as people must have feared what lay beyond their walls, they also relied upon it. Seas threatened the fisherman with drowning, but they provided his livelihood too. The forest hid all manner of danger, but that was where the hunter had to roam. The trees can hide more than deadly creatures and lawless men, however. As the ancient story of Actaeon tells us, magic and madness can lie in wait should we ever stray too far from the path. Actaeon had wandered far from home. The young huntsman had long since passed the city gates, and the fields where farmers, thumbing sweat from their brows, had stood to track his progress towards the darkness of the woods. Actaeon did not fear that wilderness. He scorned the superstitions of other men. The forest, he thought, was as much his realm as the city street. As Actaeon rested in a shady clearing, he suddenly heard an unfamiliar sound. Drawn on by the strange music, Actaeon pushed deeper and deeper into the ever-thickening forest. He parted the last branches and stared into the grove beyond. The story of Actaeon is a classical myth. To the ancient Greeks, the young huntsman was courting danger the moment he stepped beyond his city walls, the moment he entered the wild. For the Greeks, human life revolved around the city. Athens, with its resplendent temples, was the birthplace of democracy. In its golden age, it became a flourishing center of art and philosophy. Socrates and Plato called the city home, as did the great playwrights Euripides and Sophocles. Their works helped shape Western literature and thought, and they are still read, debated, and performed to this day. Athens was not only a cultural powerhouse, it had military muscle too, with a navy which dominated the Aegean Sea. This supremacy was not unchallenged, however, for Athens had a rival, another great city of ancient Greece. Renowned for its austere discipline and the skill of its hoplite warriors, Sparta was more than a match for Athens. The long war between the two great cities consumed the ancient Greek world and ultimately ended the golden age of Athens. Cities such as Athens and Sparta were the human realm. What lay beyond belonged to something else, however.
The ancient Greeks just didn't like the wilderness much, so they were profoundly unenthusiastic about anything that we would see as wilderness. They simply saw it as somewhere that you didn't want to be.
The Greeks have this view that if you're out in the wilderness, there's always this risk of walking over the boundary, of crossing into the divide.
The Greeks regarded the wilderness as so scary that the god they created to inhabit it, the god Pan, is the god from whose name we get the English word panic.
It's about the crossing in between the wild and the tame, the controlled, the uncontrolled. So there's the possibility of crossing over that line and going beyond where you should go.
It's interesting that the gods always seem much more comfortable in the wilderness than human beings are. It therefore follows that human beings who are usually out doing something like hunting, something that's very much about conquering the wilderness, usually ends badly. It's almost a way of saying, know your place, which is one of the great Greek sayings. Know that you're not a god, you're just a human being.
There's a very real sense for the Greeks that that boundary between where humans are and where the divine is very thin. And
they better understood those within. Actaeon stared into the grove. It was a wooded cave, wild and beautiful to behold. He was enraptured. He could not resist. He had to get closer. Actaeon crept forwards down to the water's edge, drawn on, ever on by the sight before him. His foot broke the stillness of the crystal waters. The ripples spread. Suddenly, dark eyes turned on the intruder, for those were no mortal creatures. This was the goddess Artemis and her nymphs, Artemis of the wilds, of the hills, of the moon. The goddess stood, cloaked in her wild fury. Actaeon ran. Actaeon's encounter with the goddess Artemis would not have surprised the ancient Greeks. For them, the wilderness was no place for man. The Greeks were not alone in seeing the wilderness as an otherworldly realm. Centuries later, the Celts of northern Europe would also sense in their great forests and rugged landscape the presence of the supernatural. The Celts were a pre-Christian people. Their origins in Central Europe date back as far as the 9th century BC. At its height, Celtic culture spread as far south as the Iberian Peninsula and as far east as modern Turkey. Celtic religion was a polytheistic one. The worship of its many gods was led by the Druids, mysterious figures of great social importance. They made prophecies, dispensed justice, and performed religious rites that may even have included human sacrifice. Celtic society and the age of the Druids was threatened, however, by the growth of the Roman Empire.
Most of our sources for the Celts are Roman sources, unfortunately, rather than surviving Celtic sources. The Celts didn't write their stuff down and the Romans did. So we have Julius Caesar's horrified account of Celtic sacrifices in oak groves, and oak groves with bits of sacrificed people hanging off them. So that's the first encounter between the Romans and the people that they came to call the Celts. And it's an encounter fraught with horror and dismay.
Interestingly, the Romans never called the Celts Celts. They call them Gauli, Gauls, or Britanni, Britons, basically. So they don't actually use the term Celts. So clearly they were aware of this slightly disparate group, which was nevertheless pressuring on their desire to establish a huge empire.
The Roman authorities suppressed the Druids, who disappeared from the written record in the 2nd century. Much of the Celts' unique cultural heritage was preserved only as an oral tradition, and so it was lost, along with the Druids.
The Druids were a challenge for the Romans because they were very, very secretive. They didn't like even writing down what their beliefs or their rituals were, and that was a problem.
The Romans found it very hard to get to understand what it was that they were facing. Faced with all that secrecy and denial, they decided that the easiest thing would be to get rid of it completely.
The Romans' attitude to the Druids was the same as their attitude to any group that they were going to take over. If there was a locus of power in that group, it had to be suppressed.
By 500 AD, the once widespread Celtic people are to be found only in northern Europe, in parts of Britain, France, and in Ireland. There, some ancient traditions survived, to be recorded by later Christian writers of the medieval period. Stories of the gods they worshipped, of the kings they served, and of the wilderness that surrounded them. The Giant's Causeway on the coast of Northern Ireland is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Its 40,000 geometric rock columns reach heights of over 10 meters, and they stretch from the cliff edge to the sea and beyond. We now know them to be the result of ancient volcanic activity, but the Celts had another explanation. To them, the causeway was the work of legendary giant Finn McCool. He was challenged to a fight by a Scottish rival, so built a great bridge of stone over the sea, so the two could meet without wetting their feet. Alongside that wilderness of rocks and trees, however, there was another, more magical realm to be discovered in the lands of the Celts, the other world.
Celtic otherworld was a supernatural realm, a realm that existed alongside of our own and parallel to our own.
It's a world that has its own laws, inhabitants, power structures, and nature. It's like something that's always there. It doesn't go away. So it's very much located in the outside, the beyond, the wild.
A glimpse might be seen in the clouds or the fleeting mist, in the half-light or in the shadows. It was at once both here and somewhere else. Stories of humans entering the elusive realm are found throughout Celtic mythology. Sometimes heroes were enticed in by a beautiful fairy maid, or they stumbled across an entrance in a cave, or under the water, or in a dream. The other world they found beyond was home to the many pre-Christian gods of the Celts. It was a land of eternal youth and beauty, where it was always summer, and there was no hunger and no despair. The realities of life for most Celts were sickness and starvation, war and want. The other world must have offered an attractive mirror image of those struggles. However, the price the other world extracted could be hefty too. Just as in the tales of the ancient Greeks, these human encounters with the supernatural did not always have a happy ending.
The Celts managed the wilderness by peopling it with entities that are somewhat like themselves. On the other hand, those entities are, more often than not, at least potentially very dangerous.
The realm of the fairies is superficially attractive. It seems quite glamorous, but often when the hero's in there, they discover that there's another side to it. Initially, the character who stumbles into the other world finds it a sort of glorious and happy place, but generally, the longer the character stays in that other world, they realize that it's more sinister, that it's got darker dimensions.
Let's take the beautiful fairy lady, who's perhaps the most typical issuer of an invitation to the Celtic otherworld. In Irish mythology, she's usually well-intentioned and usually won't do any harm in and of herself. But there's still a problem, because if you spend 3 days with her, it'll be 3 years where you came from. If you spend 3 years with her, it'll be 300 years. So when you go back home, everybody you know will be dead.
The principle of life is change, and we often regard that as a frightening thing because we don't want to grow old, we don't want to die. But yet the idea of the fairy realm suggests that the opposite is also quite horrific, that if we didn't grow old, if we stayed static, then there would be no growth, there'd be no life.
For the heroes of Celtic myth, entering this fairyland meant abandoning home and family. By their return, though, the world had changed, and there was no place left for them in human society. The stories seem to recognize that shared suffering and ultimately shared mortality are necessary for society to function. For where there is suffering, there is also kindness. And where there is death, there is a need for new life. Actaeon heeded not the rocks underfoot, nor the branches clawing at his tunic, slashing at his face. But he could not escape the goddess's rage. Actaeon had intruded, as no mortal should, upon the realm of the divine. He would have to be punished. As he ran, the bones of his face began to split and reform. Actaeon stumbled, his whole body taut with pain. Antlers burst through his skull. He tried to scream, but a stag's harsh cry had displaced his human tongue. The dogs he had left behind stirred from their rest. That familiar scent. It quickened in the mouth of every hound. Excitement quivered through the pack. A stag. The hunt had begun. Actaeon is transformed from man into stag. His dogs change from loyal companions into fanged predators. The transformation of these dogs strikes at a very human anxiety. Our communities are ordered. Laws govern our behavior. Crimes are punished. But in the natural world, it can seem that chaos reigns. Like Actian and his hounds, our grip over the wild is only ever a tenuous one. Some things are beyond our control. We are at all times exposed to the random ferocity of nature. Oceans cover over 70% of the Earth's surface. Almost every civilization in history has exploited them for food, trade, or transport. But if the waters brought opportunities, they also represented danger.
You were at the mercy of the wind and the storms. Leaving view of shore was a very dangerous undertaking that only very experienced sailors took.
It's quite normal for sailors to be scared of the sea. It's not the case that people who cross the sea are comfortable with it or at home with it. It's actually normal, the more time you spend with it, to distrust it. Even experienced sailors, even experienced mariners will be caught by surprise by the behavior of waves, by currents, by weather.
It was not just the wind and waves that sailors feared. Throughout history, there have been tales of strange creatures living in the cold blackness of the deep. The serpents of the mid-Atlantic which stalked ships of the Royal Navy. The vast devil whales seen by early Irish explorers. And, of course, the famous monster of Loch Ness in Scotland. None, however, is more terrifying than the creature said to dwell off the frozen coasts of Norway and Greenland. The King's Mirror, an old Norwegian manuscript from the 13th century, spoke of a creature that had never been caught. A beast so large, sailors mistook it for land, an enormous being which devoured fish, men, and even ships whole. They called it the Hafgufa.
The Hafgufa is a sea monster that appears in the saga of Arrowod. This sea monster is enormous and spends most of its time below the surface level of the sea. So all you ever see of it is its nostrils and its fangs. And when it comes to the surface, it looks like two big craggy rocks sticking up out of the sea. Its name is made up of two elements, the Old Norse words for sea, haf, and gufa, which is steam or vapor. So perhaps it's something about this monster's breath as it comes to the surface, looking like sea mist.
It's a sort of sea-going nightmare that illustrates the way that the ocean's depths are the ultimate wilderness, the ultimate unknown space.
The stories circulated among fishermen and traders of the north for decades. Some likened the creature to a giant crab. Others said it was more like a squid, with enormous tentacles that ensnared boats and sailors alike. All agreed, though, that not even the greatest ships of war could resist its attack. Over time, a new name emerged and stuck. The beast was dubbed the Kraken. In the 18th century, new scientific disciplines emerged. Many natural philosophers dismissed the Kraken as a fisherman's tale. But others were not so sure. Swedish zoologist Carl Linnaeus described it as a singular monster of the Norwegian seas. Danish bishop Erik Pontoppidan believed the stories too, but claimed the true danger lay not in the creature, but in the deadly whirlpools left in its wake. Modern science gives more credence to the stories than you might think. The legend of the Kraken may be a result of sailors encountering a giant squid. These unearthly-looking creatures rarely come to the surface, but can grow to enormous lengths of 13 meters and more. And it is thought even larger squid, as yet unknown to science, lurk in the inky depths.
If you see a giant squid and you're in a very small boat, that's a terrifying experience. They are unnatural looking. They have the largest eyes in proportion to any other animal. So they look incredibly powerful. Also, they can do magical things like squirting ink out of their bodies. So there's a lot of discomfort associated with that kind of creature. And they therefore figure very often in horror stories. I mean, there's one in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. There's one in Victor Hugo's book, Workers in the Sea. They often figure as man's opponents, a kind of personification of the ocean itself in its unpredictability, its enormity, and its power.
Terror and confusion at seeing such a creature may have been intensified by the condition of the sailors themselves. Hunger and malnutrition were commonplace on ocean-going ships of the past. The sailors' work was hard, and they were confined to the same small space with the same people for week after week. The combined effect all this could have on their physical and mental health was devastating.
I think if you spend hours on a ship looking out at sea as a lookout for land or for any other vessels approaching, you're going to start seeing things in the light and the water and their interaction.
It's natural to give a reason for the odd behavior of the ocean. It's in a way easier to deal with it with a bunch of superstitious and mythological interpretations than it is just to throw up your hands and say, we don't really know why it works the way it does, but I'm going out sailing again next weekend. It's much better to think in terms of sea monsters that will make a good story.
Whatever the roots of the Kraken, the tales proved enduring. And we've not lost the taste for such stories. The ocean retains its power to frighten and to enthrall. In 1975, director Steven Spielberg scored box office success with his killer shark movie Jaws, and the formula remains a popular one. For taking to the seas to sail or to swim is still to enter the unknown. For who can say what might be sharing the waters with us? What might be lurking beyond the boat's hull or beneath our kicking feet? Though today, ships cross our oceans with satellite precision, the fears provoked by open waters and the unseen depths below have not entirely disappeared. The wilderness of the sea remains a dangerous place. And in modern tales of killer sharks and the mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle, we can still hear the echo of the Kraken's roar. For thousands of years, Europe was cloaked in forests. Even the largest of its settlements and cities were mere pinpricks of light among a vast wooded darkness. It should be little surprise, then, that the forest is a common setting in the continent's myths and legends. It was both mysterious and familiar, dangerous, but within touching distance of home. It was a place of magic and adventure, a wilderness that lurked all too accessible at the bottom of the field or beyond the city gates.
The wood is one of those wilderness spaces in which scary things that you've never met before and can only imagine might lurk.
Forests do tend to have a particular value in the profile of that particular culture.
Forests are the places where the people who haven't succeeded in the arable lands end up. They end up there because they can afford to live there, because nobody owns the forest. You can't stop them from living there. They're therefore associated with the fear of not making it, with the fear of failing your family, your children, failing to provide.
Among the most famous stories of the forest are the fairy tales collected by two German academics in the 19th century, the brothers Grimm. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were born in Hanau in central Germany in the late 18th century. Their childhood was one of comfortable affluence until the death of their father in 1796 plunged the family into poverty. This traumatic upheaval affected the young brothers deeply. Relying on each other for support, the two became inseparable. Both excelled at school and went on to attend the University of Marburg. It was here that their interest in folklore began. It was an interest that would become an obsession, one that would dominate both their lives. Building on the work of French academics such as Charles Perrault and Baroness d'Aulnoy, the brothers began a patriotic project to collect the folk tales of their own land. They spoke to German peasants and aristocrats, farmers and city dwellers, and documented the stories they heard.
The Grimm tales were collected from people who lived in Hesse, which, though it was quite industrialized by the Grimm's time, had a lot of woods in it.
About 10 or 11% of the United Kingdom is covered by what we would call woodland. In Germany, even today, it's something like 35%. So forests are everywhere. Now, there's a particular reason for that, which is that the Germans place a high esteem on unspoilt nature. That's simply a cultural given. And that means that in some ways, Germans value a radical encounter with otherness represented by the forest in their renditions of fairy tales.
Their stories handed down by families who lived among those woods and who often lived very difficult and impoverished lives.
The Grimms collected stories from a whole range of sources, in the main from middle-class bourgeois friends and neighbours and people in their own social circle. They'd often take several different versions of the same story, take the bits they liked, cannibalise them in effect, and combine them into a new story.
They were adapting the tales, of course, for an educated, literate public, a middle-class and aristocratic public, and they were adapting the content of those tales, of course, to the expectations of that public.
In 1812, the Grimms published the first volume of their children's and household tales. 3 years later, the brothers added a second volume, forming what we now know as Grimm's Fairy Tales. After its initial publication, the brothers spent the next 4 decades revising and expanding their collection. The 7th and final edition of 1857 contained more than 200 stories. Many of those tales are now familiar to Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Hansel and Gretel, and many more. The Grimms' enterprise was not simply an act of scholarly record, however. Over the years, the brothers rewrote many of the stories themselves. They minimized sexual elements and softened other darker themes. In earlier versions, Little Red Riding Hood was eaten by the big bad wolf. Sleeping Beauty was raped, not kissed. And Hansel and Gretel were neglected, not by their evil stepmother, but by their own parents.
For them properly. The reason we need to tell ourselves these stories is because we need to be sure that we're not those people. We need to differentiate ourselves from those people and make out that we are much more loving and careful as parents.
Some have interpreted these stories as cautionary tales. Little Red Riding Hood tells us to obey our elders, beware the woods, and be cautious of strangers from beyond our homes. Others have taken a more psychoanalytic approach. Employing the concepts of Sigmund Freud, these interpretations recast the story as one of sexual awakening. The dark woods are a symbol of the unconscious mind. Obedient and innocent, she is the archetypal female. The wolf, on the other hand, hungry and aggressive, is the male. When they meet later at the grandmother's house, Little Red Riding Hood recognizes the wolf in his disguise, but does not flee. Instead, she climbs into bed with him. The scene is a seduction, and Little Red Riding Hood is a willing participant.
Fairy tales, like all stories, have an element of content which is not explicit on the surface. Psychoanalysts have also argued that fairy tales communicate to us at the level of the unconscious. In particular, they communicate to children at the unconscious level.
In real life, wolves very rarely attack human beings. They're actually quite sensible animals. So it follows, therefore, that wolves must be symbolic rather than representing an actual threat. What they seem to represent, it's the fear that human beings who live in woods might become wild and wood-like. They represent this sort of savage interior that has to be carefully contained, controlled, and muzzled by civilization.
If the wolf is a symbol of the wildness lurking within us all, then its frequent presence in these stories is a reminder that however grandly we build our monuments, however elegantly we draft our laws, civilization is ultimately a fiction, a veneer far thinner than we would like to admit. The smallest of slips can see it crack and set loose that savage interior, that wolf, in terrifying fashion. Hurtling through bush and trees, Actaeon's hounds streamed after him as never before. The transformed huntsman urged his unfamiliar limbs on. Close behind was Blackfoot Melampus, swift as the wind. Beside him, Snatcher, fiercest of all, and Shepherd, his favourite, who knew not his master's call. Actaeon crashed on through the woods, but the trees closed tight around him. There was nowhere left to run. On every side, the ravenous dogs surrounded their dear master. Teeth sank into flesh, tearing and slicing, ripping and biting. So they ended the life of Actaeon and slaked the goddess's rage. Actaeon's grisly death comes a long way from home, deep in the wilderness that was the untamed forest. His story is one of the most famous and enduring in all Greek mythology. It has inspired writers, sculptors, and artists in generation after generation. For though the age of the ancient Greeks is long past, our fascination with the wild unknown remains undimmed. Throughout history, societies have used the wilderness to explore what frightens us about the world and about ourselves, to help us understand what it means to be part of a family, part of a community, and what it means to lose those things.
The wilderness is, in some respects, the opposite of civilization, but also there's a sense in which we carry a bit of wildness in ourselves as well.
The wilderness also becomes a place for exploring what happens when humans get too civilized. What does it mean when we go too far, where we start sort of becoming too artificial and too false?
It might be the mountains, it might be the heath. It's the place where, because you haven't got a big rational take on it, you can fill it with the irrational, the parts of yourself that you normally repress or crush.
It continually calls to us as being untamed, and we are drawn by the lure of taming it, but it will never actually give in to our control.
Today, perhaps we like to think we pushed the wilderness back, but though our cities may now stretch to the horizon, we can never banish the wilderness entirely. We can sense it in the silence of a deserted wood or in the roar of a storm breaking over a distant mountainside. But it is with us, always. Our maps may grow ever more detailed, but the wild unknown will always lurk at the edges. Tales have been told since man first gathered around the fires of prehistory. Tales of the strange and wondrous things hidden in the vast unknown shadows of the world. Tales of creatures divine and beasts demonic, gods and kings, of myths and monsters. From dark forests to the lands of ice, from desert wastes to the storm-thrashed seas, every corner of the earth has its legends to tell. Stories of heroes and the villains they encounter, of the wilderness and the dangers within. Stories of battles, of love, of order, and of chaos. But what are the roots of these fantastic tales? And why have they endured so long? In this series, we'll explore the history behind these legends and reveal the hidden influences that shaped them. War and disease, religious and social upheaval, the untamable ferocity of the natural world. And above all, the monsters lurking within ourselves. The battlefield today belongs to the sniper, the tank, the bomb, the bullet, and we seek ever more inventive means of mutual destruction. But why do we fight? It is a question asked by every culture and by every generation. For our world has always been at war. Through the millennia of human existence, we have fought for land and wealth, for love and revenge, to liberate and to oppress, to save allies and to punish. We have fought and fought again.
War is an intense period of struggle, so it's also therefore an intense period of cultural definition.
War allows you to see the ethical priorities of a culture that's created it. How do we cope with people we've captured? What do we do if we lose? Who do we go to war against?
Society's stories of war tell us what values they hold dear and that they maintain through warfare.
They're a way of incorporating unpredictable forces into a belief system that help people to make sense of things that they couldn't prevent or predict.
In a society's representation of war, it represents what it thinks of itself, what its ideals are. It determines what values the culture holds dear.
Whether by choice or necessity, war has been a constant in human history, and all civilizations have had to grapple with the questions it raises. The stories we tell of war, the justifications we find for violence, and the condolences we seek for loss all reveal something about our values as individuals and as societies. The Nemedians had come seeking a new home, but they found in Ireland only misery. For they were enslaved by the Fomorians, cruel ogres renowned for their greed. Chief among these terrors were the two strongest and ugliest ogres, Mork and his brother Conan. The fruit of the Nemedians' labor they seized for themselves. But the Nemedians had not come so far to be slaves forever. One man stood against their foe. Fergus Redside was his name. He was the son of the great hero Nemed himself. He stirred rebellion among the huts and shacks of the Nemedian villagers. No longer would they bear the oppression of Conan and Mork. They wearied of their servitude. They readied themselves for war. The story of the Nemedians and their oppression by the Fomorians is told in the Celtic Book of Invasions. Compiled around the 11th century, the book charts the history of Ireland from creation through to the Middle Ages. It tells the stories of 5 mythical tribes who invaded Ireland one by one before the final arrival of the Gaelic people and the establishment of a Christian kingdom. Origin stories such as this are common. Almost every civilization thinks it is special and develops a myth of its beginnings to prove it. The bustling heart of modern Italy is today one of the largest cities in Europe. It has been continuously inhabited for more than 3,000 years. And everywhere in the city can be seen the remnants of that long history, relics of an age when the city ruled the world. By the 2nd century, almost 100 million people lived under Roman rule, a fifth of the world's population at the time. Rome's power stretched from the north of Britain to Egypt in the south, from Spain in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east. The image is famous to this day, a she-wolf suckling 2 infant boys as if they were her own. These were the twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. Their grandfather, the king, had been usurped and the boys banished from home. Thanks to the she-wolf, however, they survived long enough to be found by a shepherd who raised them as his own. Growing up, the twins discovered their birthright and helped their grandfather retake his crown. They then set out to found a city of their own. Each began construction in a different place, and the dispute soon took a violent turn. When Remus mockingly leapt over his brother's budding defenses, Romulus responded with a fatal blow and the words, "So perish anyone who attacks my walls."
The foundation of Rome rests on fratricide, brother killing brother. It's not a positive place to start your story.
Usually you'd expect a single hero who's the foundation of the nation, whereas in this instance we have 2 competing heroes.
It's a very, very weird foundation myth. It takes away from that idea of a single exemplar of the virtues of the civilization that's founded. Indeed, neither Romulus nor Remus is particularly exemplary. Remus because he gets killed, and Romulus because he murders his own brother.
The tale troubled and intrigued the Romans, especially as it was regarded not as myth, but as history, and history that could be seen and touched. The temple of Jupiter Stator by the Forum was said to have been founded by Romulus himself. For centuries, his hut was preserved on the Palatine Hill, and Romans could even visit the cave where the she-wolf was said to have cared for the infant boys.
We might expect them to be a bit awkward about this story, but they're not. They tell it again and again and again. It's recorded in the primary sources. It's recorded as something that is an important part of what it means to be Roman. It was grounded very much in the physical location of Rome, as the whole of the Romulus and Remus myth is. It was very much about the roots these people had in this particular patch of ground, which is why we always talk about the Roman Empire. Despite how far it's, we always come back to Rome, to these particular locations that all had the capability to be told and to be shaped and to be retold and reshaped as you needed to do so. So there were alternative versions told.
It's Cicero who actually denies that Romulus kills Remus and actually sort of deletes the part of the myth that probably gave it its purchase on the Roman imagination. The idea that in drinking the milk of a wolf, Romulus and Remus are imbibing a ferocity that Rome has yet fully to contain is in part why Cicero's and Virgil's generation want to forget the whole thing. Plus, they invent a bunch of other, much sleeker, much more fit-for-purpose foundation myths, of which the best known is the one invented by Virgil, the myth of Aeneas.
The noble, heroic Aeneas was a refugee from Troy. He led his people across the Mediterranean to Italy, where he founded the city that would one day give rise to the Roman people. His story is told most famously by the poet Virgil in his great epic, the Aeneid. He was writing during a new era in Roman history. Augustus was consolidating his power as the first emperor, and the grander, more dignified origin story offered by the Aeneid seemed fit for the times. But if it was intended to eclipse older stories in the Roman imagination, it would fail. Romulus and Remus would retain their place in the history books of ancient Rome. But of course, it wasn't real history at all. The brothers did not create Rome, Rome created them. It was not the murder of Remus that explained the violence of the Romans. It was the violence of the Romans that lay behind the myth.
Military life goes through all aspects of Roman society. The Roman army is conscript. It's not a volunteer professional force. And that means that you have a very high proportion of people in Rome, broadly speaking, who either will have been in the army or will have relatives who have been in the army. So there's a knowledge and a familiarity with military matters that is very deeply embedded in everyday life and everyday activity.
He does one really interesting thing that's very important for Roman ideas of the self and the relation between the individual and the city. And that is, he's killed by Romulus. So the point of the story then becomes, even my brother is less important to me than defending Rome. It's Rome above all. Remus is there to show that Romulus is willing, and all Romans must be willing, to sacrifice familial ties for the city.
Perhaps that is why the bloody story of the twins endured. No finer mirror of the city's character could be found. In one act of fraternal bloodshed, the myth taught Romans that the success of their city relied not only on violence, but on sacrifice. Rome was great, but so was the price paid. The Tower of Conand, the great fortress, lay before them. The Numidians, 30,000 of them, had come to claim their freedom. These men were farmers, not soldiers, but they would fight all the same. For they were led by a brave and mighty warrior, Fergus Redside, the son of Nemeth. From the high tower, Conand watched them gather with an outraged snarl. The impudence of these slaves. Massed on the plain below, the Numidian army grew larger and larger. Hammer and pike, scythe and spear, they held their weapons aloft and roared in time to the beat of the drum. The great ogre was readied. Armor was strapped to his body. The men raised their swords. The drums grew louder. The battle was about to begin. Despite war's constant presence in history, few of us are natural soldiers. Killing other people runs against the instincts of most, and sheer terror on the battlefield paralyzes many more. It's no surprise, then, that throughout history we find enemies dehumanized, and the glory of a heroic death magnified. The sentiments are found in the words of politicians and poets, in the works of sculptors and painters, and in the stories and myths that cultures held dear. The frozen north is no place for the faint-hearted. Its winters are long and dark. It is a land of sheer cliffs and deep fjords, of rock and ice. To live in such a place is to battle against the elements, and such extremes of nature perhaps produce extremes of man. The Norse lived in Scandinavia between the 8th and 11th centuries. It was a society that extolled war and battle, whose daring warriors crossed continents in search of glory. What lay behind their success was a mastery of sailing. In 793, the Norse launched a raid on Lindisfarne, a sacred island off the northeast coast of England. The monastery there was looted and its inhabitants slaughtered. The age of the Vikings had begun. The attack on Lindisfarne stunned Christian Europe. One contemporary wrote, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we've now suffered from a pagan race."
I think there were two quite important factors about the Norse that made them appear genuinely shocking. And that was that they arrived in boats, they struck somewhere quickly, and they moved on, and there was no way of knowing where they would go next. And also, there's the whole culture clash. You can't say that the Vikings and the Norse ever raided because they were thinking about religious differences, but from the point of view of the Anglo-Saxons, those religious differences mattered a lot.
Stories of the brave and barbarous Vikings spread quickly. Most feared among their warriors were the berserkers. These shock troops fought in a trance-like fury and seemed to experience no pain or fear. But if this was a culture that glorified war, then all parts of Norse society, women included, played a role. Girls were often given warlike names. Gunhild, for instance, was a popular choice and literally meant war battle. In time, of course, they were expected to raise strong future warriors themselves, and any deformed babies were to be abandoned in the elements to die. One thing they did not do was fight. They were not trained as warriors, as men were. According to mythology, however, there was still a female presence on the battlefield, and they had the most important job of all.
The Valkyries are immortal warrior maidens whose job it is to decide which warriors get to fall in battle.
They were then tasked with taking the souls of the dead warriors to Valhalla, which is in effect the afterlife presided over by the god Odin.
You might think of Valhalla as similar to the way in which knights going on crusade were told that their sins would be pardoned if they died in a crusade. It sweetens the deal a bit. It knocks the edges off the fear of telling them that if they die in battle, they're going to live a lovely life where they're given mead all the time and they just have to fight each day for Odin, and then they're resurrected and they go back to feasting. It makes the idea of dying in battle seem less terrible.
The promise of Valhalla must have offered comfort to the fearful before battle, and solace to those grieving afterwards. Death on the battlefield was recast as a mirror of birth, and just as it was women who once brought men into the world, so it was females who carried them into the next.
The gender of the Valkyries is often bound up in the roles that they perform in the myths. So in Valhalla, when they're bringing the mead cup round to the warriors, this is very much the role of the noble woman in society as well. It's what the hostess would do at a great feast or a gathering in a king or a lord's hall.
Fate figures are nearly always female in all European mythologies. There is an unbelievably creepy Valkyrie moment in Njál's saga, where you actually see the Valkyries weaving with men's intestines and using men's severed skulls as weights.
Instead of the tools of the trade, they have a shuttle that is a spearhead, and they beat the wall with a sword rather than the standard wooden tool that they'd use.
Weaving is normally a virtuous thing for householders to do, but these women are weaving with guts and heads, so they're doing something that's on the one hand really uber feminine, but on the other hand is a creepy inverted version of it.
Stories of war and the Valkyries are found throughout Norse mythology. The gods constantly fought amongst themselves and against their rivals, the giant and monstrous Jötnar. But were the Norse as belligerent a people as we often think? Is their reputation for violent banditry, which remains to this day, a fair one? Were they all Vikings?
There's a great deal of association between the Norse and a particularly savage kind of violence, and that's frequently overstated. In the context of the time they lived in, I don't think the violence committed by the Norse was any inherently worse than the violence committed by other medieval societies. I don't think you could quantify the effect of murder and arson and theft by the Norse as being any worse than the murder and arson and theft that occurred within Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and continental royal houses.
It's fair to say that they're expansionist and that their method of expansion is ship-based, and that their modus operandi is, on the whole, to cross the seas and raid foreign countries and take slaves and take plunder and then sail home with that. But they also tend to settle in areas that they frequently raid, so they don't remain these outsider pillagers. When they establish themselves, they form societies, and then we can pick out the really much more positive associations.
The bold spirit of the Norse saw them dominate England and found settlements stretching from the Black Sea to North America. But this golden period was fleeting. By the middle of the 11th century, Christianity had supplanted the indigenous faith. The Valkyries flew no more. The Viking age was ending. The two armies charged at one another, thrusting and slashing, cutting and stabbing. So the enemies met. The Fomorians were led into battle by Colin himself. and there was only one man who dared face him. Conand towered over him, but Redside was a brave and skillful warrior. Back and forth, the two champions fought, metal ringing on metal, each waiting for the other to slip, for a chance to end the battle with one fatal blow. Still eager, still strong, Conand charged, but it was a ruse. Redside dodged the mighty ogre's sword and lunged forward, his own blade flashing. The great ogre roared out in pain before collapsing to the ground with a mighty thud. Conand had fallen. No battle is without loss, and even victory cannot displace all the pain, grief, and anger. The scars of combat can run as deep in the mind as they do in the body. And the greatest stories of war know this. In the Anatolian expanses of modern Turkey, just south of the Dardanelles Strait, which divides Europe from Asia, there was once a place of legend. A mighty fortress overlooking the plains, a city of wealth and beauty. The remnants of its thick walls are now shrouded beneath the earth. Its lavish temples and palaces crumbled to dust. But it was amid the rocks and rivers of this ancient plain that the greatest conflict in all myth took place, the Trojan War. It was a war sparked by the abduction of Queen Helen of Sparta by Prince Paris of Troy. An alliance of Greek kings then sailed to Troy with their armies to bring her back. A 10-year siege ensued. Only cunning ended the long stalemate. The Trojans were fooled into letting the Greeks beyond their gates. Troy was brutally sacked soon afterwards. Countless works of art have been inspired by the war. In its long duration and bloody aftermath, there are near infinite opportunities to explore the meaning and impact of conflict.
The Trojan War offers an opportunity to look at a very wide range of human life. It offers the opportunity to look at the failure of guest friendship, what happens when those bounds of hospitality are broken, conflict in between two different regions, the coming together of the Greeks for a single purpose. All of these kinds of things the myth allows the Greeks to explore through one particular narrative. It doesn't just talk about war to glorify it. It also really offers an opportunity to look at the human cost, the people who suffer as a result of war.
But one account of the war has endured above all others. A poem composed almost 3,000 years ago. Alexander the Great conquered the world with a copy at his side, and soldiers and civilians alike have for centuries looked to it for a better understanding of war in their own times. That poem is the ancient Greek epic, the Iliad. Said to be the work of an author known as Homer, the written version of the poem dates to the 8th century BC. Its roots, however, are older still, in an oral tradition which stretches back hundreds of years more. The Iliad does not focus on the end of the Trojan War, nor on its beginnings. Instead, it tells one short episode during the last year of the conflict. Homer makes monsters of neither Trojans nor Greeks. The poet instead grants equal dignity to the soldier far from home and the civilian trapped in theirs. What the enemies have in common is emphasized: the love of family, the pain of loss, the inevitability of death.
One lovely example of a moment of emotional connection with the family is the Trojan hero Hector in the Iliad, who puts on his helmet and then goes to kiss his wife, Andromache, goodbye. She's with his little boy, who's only a tiny child. And the little boy looks at Hector in his helmet and he starts to cry. He doesn't recognize his father because he's wearing this great helmet. And Hector starts to laugh and throws the little boy up in the air and passes him back to his wife. But it's a lovely, affectionate moment. This lovely little domestic detail that humanizes him and makes it clear that he's fighting in the most literal possible way, not just for his city as a political entity, but for his family in its extraordinary vulnerability.
You could read the epic as being about the unreasonableness of war, the pettiness of war, and therefore the human need to rise above that, to try and remain human and humane within that struggle.
Hector falls in combat at the hands of the Greek hero Achilles. It was his fate to die, and for his city to eventually fall. But he carried on nonetheless. He fought to the end. His story still speaks to us, for death comes for all, but we all must carry on.
It's about very fundamental aspects of human experience: jealousy, anger, rage, struggle, love, hate. All these things are really fundamental parts of the human experience.
Every generation that has read the poem has repurposed its characters and events for their own times. After the fall of Rome, however, Homer's text was lost to Western Europe for centuries. But after rediscovery during the Renaissance, the Iliad went on to become a foundation stone of Western literature. It continues to shape our thoughts about war to this day. For though in many ways combat has changed beyond recognition, the Iliad captures something unchanging about war. The poem glories in it and damns it just the same. It is a city with many names. First, it was Byzantium. Later, it became Constantinople. But to many, it was just the city. And though we may not recognize it, that is how we know it to this day. For Istanbul is derived from the Greek words Aestin Polin, meaning to the city. That city was once the largest and wealthiest in Europe, and a holy place of Christianity. In 1453, however, it fell to the invading forces of the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman Empire was the superpower of its day, an expansionist and aggressive one at that.
It was just assumed that nowhere Christian could really fall to Islam. It was just assumed that God would protect it. The idea that something so strong could collapse just dismayed and horrified them.
According to the Christian understanding, God really shouldn't have allowed it to fall in the way it did.
The conquest of the city shocked Europe. It would not be the end of the Ottomans' ambitions in the West, however.
It expanded all the way into Eastern Europe. In fact, virtually all of what we now think of as the Balkans was either ruled directly by the Ottomans or was an Ottoman vassal.
In this state of near-constant war that followed, new stories and legends emerged. And just as men can make myths out of war, war can make myths out of men. Wallachia was a small principality in what is modern-day Romania. To the north stretched the Transylvanian Alps. To the south lay the mighty Danube. This was the land that Prince Vlad Dracula called home. Between 1448 and 1476, he ruled Wallachia on 3 separate occasions. All these reigns were brief. but his fame has become immortal nevertheless. He was the inspiration behind Bram Stoker's legendary vampire Dracula. But Vlad was notorious long before the publication of Stoker's novel in 1897. In his own time, he was reviled as a sadist, whose taste for the cruelest of punishments led to his gruesome nickname, Vlad the Impaler.
A German Meistersinger produced a poem that was actually sung in front of the then Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III, which told of Vlad's crimes in detail. And one of the crimes that it emphasized was that he impaled his victims on stakes.
There are stories of Vlad the Impaler eating his dinner while his enemies writhed around him, impaled on spikes.
Later, this was elaborated even further, and there were some really grisly tales of mothers and infants being impaled together so that the infants were trying to clutch at the mothers and the mothers were trying to protect the infants, but they both died. Really gruesome stuff.
But how fair was Vlad's reputation? Where's the truth amid the legend? And why did the tales spread and endure? Vlad lived at a time of upheaval. His lands were caught between the Christian powers to the west and the might of the Ottoman Empire to the east. In 1417, Wallachia had become a vassal state of the Ottomans. Vlad's father was the then ruler of the principality, but he was murdered in 1447 and his crown usurped. For decades afterwards, control of the region was contested again and again. As a grown man, Vlad fought to win back what he regarded as his birthright. At times, he allied himself with the Ottomans, at others, he joined the forces arrayed against them. But his reigns in Wallachia were short, unstable affairs. He was a man with many enemies. In 1462, having once again lost his crown, Vlad traveled to Transylvania to seek the help of the Hungarian king, Matthew Corvinus. Instead, the king had Vlad imprisoned. It was at this time that stories of Vlad's unique brutality began to spread.
As soon as you have a war, hostilities of any kind, the atrocity stories begin. People really got off on exaggerating the evil Eastern European weirdness of this guy, and it just got more and more exaggerated and peculiar as the Western presses churned it out.
Even in his own lifetime, the man was becoming myth. And the stories of the cruelty and wickedness of Vlad Dracula did not disappear with his death in 1476. But legends are changeable things. Once a man becomes myth, he can be repackaged and repurposed again and again. In more recent years, there's been a reappraisal of Vlad III. He has become a perhaps unlikely hero. Romania was long dominated by foreign powers. It was subject to the Ottomans until the 19th century in the establishment of the Kingdom of Romania. But that was swept away after the Second World War, and Romania was once again in the shadow of a greater power, this time Soviet Russia.
Like many post-communist countries, it's eager to go back to the time before communism and find heroes that predate those days. And Vlad is a perfect candidate.
He was recast as a harsh yet just ruler who strengthened central government and fought for the nation at a time of conflict and unrest. In the schoolrooms of Romania, Vlad's story is still told. For defiance in the face of oppression will always appeal. The battle was over. The Numidians celebrated. It was Fergus Redside who had triumphed, but few in his army had escaped the battle with the Fomorians unharmed. And as they tended to the wounded, a dread sound echoed across the island. It came from the sea. A fleet of ships cut through the waves towards them. It was another Fomorian army. Mork, brother of the defeated Colin, was already come for revenge. With a cry, Redside rallied his weary men. They charged the beach to fight once more. In the battle that followed, not one fled from the other. Redside and Mork, Nemedian and Fomorian alike, they fell in mutual slaughter. The beach was stained crimson with their blood. Of the 30,000 Nemedians who had come to win their freedom, just 30 survived. This mournful band of the wounded and the weary seized a Fomorian ship. They sailed away, far from Ireland, and far away from the cruelty of the Fomorians. The defeat of the Nemedians in the Celtic Book of Invasions paves the way for the arrival of the Irish people themselves. The book made war a part of their origins, of their identity as a people, as it was for so many others. From the time of the Romans to that of the Norse, from the golden age of ancient Greece through to this very day, the character of individuals and of nations has been shaped by myths of war. They can tell us where we've come from and where we go after death. They tell us what makes us different from others and what we have in common. They tell us what we cherish, what we deplore, what we aspire to, and what we fear. They tell us who we are. The weapons of war have changed down the centuries. And though battles on the field may look different today, the battles within us remain much the same. Tales have been told since man first gathered around the fires of prehistory. Tales of the strange and wondrous things hidden in the vast unknown shadows of the world. Tales of creatures divine and beasts demonic, of gods and kings, of myths and monsters. From dark forests to the lands of ice, from desert wastes to the storm-thrashed seas, every corner of the earth has its legends to tell. Stories of heroes and the villains they encounter, of the wilderness and the dangers within. Stories of battles, of love, of order, and of chaos. But what are the roots of these fantastic tales? And why have they endured so long? In this series, we'll explore the history behind these legends and reveal the hidden influences that shaped them. War and disease, religious and social upheaval, the untamable ferocity of the natural world. And above all, the monsters lurking within ourselves. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love never fails. It is our most prized emotion. We pursue it, we treasure it, and we mourn its loss. But there is a darker side to love, for with desire comes jealousy, and with devotion, betrayal. Unleashed, love can wreak violence, destruction, madness, and murder. It is in myth and legend that society wrestles with the twisting nature of love. How it can inspire us and devour us. How we try to explain it, and whether we can ever control it.
Love stories can tell us about the value placed on love, about the significance given to it, about how it was conceived.
Well, love stories and myths are often about ways in which societies react, ways in which societies structure gender roles.
What always strikes me about them is how few stories we would call love stories in the tradition don't somehow rest on a power imbalance.
They are really telling us about the fears, the aspirations, and often the dynamics in the society in which they're told.
What it tells us is that we're not the rational human beings that we think we are, that we're also big squashy tubs of deep feeling that we can't altogether manage.
Stories of love and betrayal in all its forms have provided the inspiration for some of our greatest works of literature and art. And we still return to them time and again. They tell us love can be great, but that it can also be dangerous. The royal convoy jolted over dirt roads. The journey had been a long one. Not a breeze disturbed the furnace heat of the day. Princess Iphigenia peered out at the countryside. Her mother, Queen Clytemnestra, dozed beside her. They had not stopped since that breathless messenger had first come to the palace. It was an urgent message from her husband, King Agamemnon. Clytemnestra was to join him at the distant port of Aulis, and she was to bring with her their beloved daughter, the beautiful Iphigenia. The carriage rumbled on. It would be hours before they reached their destination. Iphigenia examined an errant lock of hair. This would not do. She called the convoy to a halt and summoned her handmaidens. They shaped her hair into intricate braids. Jewels of gold were set about them. She wanted to look her best, for Iphigenia was on her way to get married. In modern society, most marriages, to start with at least, are based on love. But that was not always the case. In centuries past, marriages, especially among the elite, were more often an alliance between families or nations. You did not marry for happiness. You married to fill a treasury, to avoid a war, or, as in the Norse tale of the Lay of Thrym, to reclaim something that was stolen. In the mythology of the Norsemen of Scandinavia, there was a land far beyond the realms of men and gods. It was a land bleak and beautiful, of towering forests and raging storms. It was the home of the giants. This was the realm that Thor, the god of thunder, ventured to in search of his stolen hammer. Without that mighty weapon, he was unable to defend Asgard from its enemies. He had to reclaim it. The story of how he did is part of the Poetic Edda, a fragmentary collection of Old Norse poems. The Poetic Edda was compiled in the 13th century, but the stories it contains are far more ancient. They're remnants of an oral tradition dating back centuries. The tale of Thor and his missing hammer is among the collection's most popular stories. The thunder god soon realized where it had gone. It had been stolen by Thrym, the hideous chief of the giants, and he would only return it on one condition. Freya, the goddess of love, had to marry him. Thor and his brother, the trickster god Loki, tried to convince her, but Freya refused. If Thor was to get his hammer back, he would have to find another way. His fellow gods had a suggestion. Thor himself should be Thrym's bride. The thunder god was unimpressed with the idea of disguising himself as a woman. But he had no choice.
The Lay of Thrym gives people a chance to kind of play the what-if game. If this were possible, what would happen? So very rarely in these love stories do you get a picture of what society is like. You get a picture either of what society could be like or what some of the pitfalls and important dynamics of marriages and love affairs are within the society itself.
There's a lot of wacky gender bending in and around the Norse way of thinking, and it doesn't seem like that was because they were comfortable with gender bending. It actually seems like the opposite.
But you can certainly see how important marriage was. Marriages were alliances. They were not love marriages whatsoever. And you can see this because the giants will sort of say, well, we have this or we will do this, but only if you give us Freya in marriage.
With his brother Loki beside him, dressed as a bridesmaid, Thor went to the land of the giants for the wedding feast. As part of the ceremony, the hammer was placed in his lap. His chance had finally come. He seized his weapon and threw off his disguise. The giants scattered, but there was no escape from the thunder god. Thor struck down first his stunned husband-to-be Thrym, and then all the other giants as well. Victorious, he returned to Asgard, his hammer and his masculinity restored at last. The tales of the Norse gods were often grotesque, but they represent a kind of funhouse mirror to Viking culture, distorted though they may be. Something of the true form can still be seen. In a way, Thor's disguise reflects the position women held in Norse society. The macho god was silenced as he donned the bridal robes. He remained quiet throughout the deception. His deep voice, of course, would have given him away, but his silence is revealing. To become a Norse woman in public, Thor had to lose his voice. The structure of Norse society was undoubtedly a patriarchal one. But that did not mean women were without power.
The thing with patriarchal societies is that you're actually talking about the structure of society. In practice, things were often very different. Just in pragmatic terms, the women are very important. They would, in effect, be much more equal in terms of what was going on.
Norse society consisted of two kinds of activity. You have the Vikings when they're off in their war bands doing raids, and then you have, if you will, the Vikings at home. The Vikings at home, you have a strikingly different picture. It's almost matriarchal. The women in Iceland and in the Norselands are very powerful, and they are strongly in control of what goes on within their kinship network.
Norse women did not become chieftains nor accompany men on their foreign raids. They forged their own roles instead. Less visible, perhaps, but influential all the same. The story of the Lay of Thrym reminds us that silent and meek though they may have appeared, Norse women could be powerful too. The port of Aulis. Here King Agamemnon had gathered his vast army, and here they waited. for there was no sign of the wind needed to carry them to war. In a tent perched high above the placid seas, Princess Iphigenia waited with her mother. She had never looked more beautiful. But then she had never met her future husband before. In the greatest army ever assembled, he was the greatest warrior, Achilles. This was the man Iphigenia had come so far to meet. This was the man her father had promised her. Achilles noticed Iphigenia staring at him and smiled. He looked every inch the son of a goddess. Iphigenia bowed. "What is it that brings you to Aulis?" the warrior said. He did not know of any wedding. Agamemnon had lied. He had lied to his wife. He had lied to his daughter. Tears pricked her eyes, but she would not let them see. She ran from the room, pushing past the guards. If it was not Achilles, then who was she there to marry? Iphigenia's disappointment is understandable. Rejection and dashed expectations are the price often demanded by love. But in mythology, even those who do marry may not find happiness. Cornwall in southwest England, an ancient coastline carved by the long ravages of sea and wind. This is a land of cove and beach, cliff and valley, a land with its own culture, its own language, and its own legends to tell. The story of Tristan and Isolde dates back to the 12th century. It tells of a love triangle between a handsome young knight, a beautiful Irish princess, and her husband, Cornwall. The match between Isolde and King Mark was intended to bring peace between long warring kingdoms. Tristan was Mark's nephew and favorite knight. He was the one entrusted with bringing Isolde to Cornwall from Ireland. On that journey, however, Tristan and Isolde drank a potion, which made them fall madly in love.
The significance of the love potion varies a bit depending on which author is talking about it. But it is often administered in Isolde without either of them knowing what's going on.
The potion just represents overmastering desire, that moment where you just throw caution to the winds, and even though you know you shouldn't, you're longing to do it so much that you just do it anyway.
It absolves them from morality in the sense that it allows the authors in this story to kind of look at other things. What is the nature of a knight who is very loyal to the king, and indeed the nephew of the king in many of these stories? What happens when that person becomes totally involved in this kind of emotion?
Isolde did go on to marry Tristan's uncle, King Mark. Peace between Ireland and Cornwall demanded it. But the potion had not worn off. The affair with Tristan continued. All three characters loved one another. Tristan desired Isolde but respected his uncle. The king loved Tristan as a son and Isolde as a wife. She was grateful for his kindness but could not resist her lover. All three were plagued by terrible dreams of the future. These would prove prophetic. For eventually, King Mark did discover the affair. He plotted to kill the treacherous young couple. Tristan and Isolde managed to escape death, fleeing into the wild. But they found no happiness there either. They were still consumed with guilt. Their story was inspired by earlier Celtic tales. It, in turn, would shape later romances. Its influence can be seen in the tale of Lancelot and Guinevere. The first known account of the tragic love affair between King Arthur's wife and his greatest knight dates from the 12th century. It was written by Chrétien de Troyes, a French court poet.
Chrétien de Troyes is one of the most famous of the medieval romance writers. He pretty well invented Arthurian romance. The most famous story is Lancelot and Guinevere. Chrétien introduces Lancelot into the Arthurian legend.
Lancelot is a latecomer, really, to the Round Table, and he comes from a much more courtly era than those earlier sort of wilder, hairier knights. He's much more polished. He not only has great physical prowess, but also really knows his way around a banquet hall, is good with fashion, is physically beautiful, rather than just being big and burly and strong. That's what Chrétien brings into the story.
By the time Chrétien was writing in the 12th century, the notion of courtly love was becoming very popular. And what this meant is that the warrior knight would be civilized through the love of a lady. The idea was that if you loved this unattainable woman, it would spur you on to do greater and greater deeds.
The story was an appealing one for the women of the French court. In their everyday lives, the dynastic and political triumphed over the romantic. Arranged marriages were the norm. Husbands would disappear for years at a time on pilgrimage or crusade, while they were free to have mistresses. For women, the bonds of marriage were unbreakable.
One of the key things to understand is that many of the most powerful patrons to which these writers of the 11th and 12th centuries are trying to appeal are women. If you're trying to appeal to these highly educated, very sophisticated French-speaking women, you're obviously going to want to tell them stories about other very highly educated, very sophisticated women and their interesting love lives.
At this period, you get another thing which is very interesting, which is the beginning of proper feminist literature. You have female writers sort of saying, look, women are not just Eve figures who introduced sex into the world. They're not just bargaining chips in marriage. They have a psychology of their own. They have morality. They have something to contribute. Aristocratic women, at least, were beginning to be able to articulate their place in society, their own psychology, their own identity.
More was at stake in these stories than hurt feelings alone. Tristan and Isolde's affair endangered the truce between Cornwall and Ireland. Peace was only assured when the couple decided to separate. Isolde returned to King Mark, and Tristan left Cornwall forever. In these stories, the fate of nations rests on affairs of the heart. They remind us that behind great moments of history often lie human relationships and human failings. They explore how all of us must reconcile private passions with other responsibilities, and they ask, when our loyalties, our loves compete, which will triumph? And what will the consequences be? The miserable Iphigenia was dressed in her wedding finery. Her mother led her towards the altar. Her father, Agamemnon, waited there. All the other kings of Greece stood with him. But which of the old men was to be Iphigenia's husband? We are all of us but mortal, the king's voice trembled. We cannot defy the gods. Iphigenia was blindfolded, for Agamemnon had displeased the goddess Artemis. She was the one who had stilled the winds. A terrible sacrifice was demanded if ever the Greeks were to reach Troy. Clytemnestra surged forward, trying to reach her daughter, but strong arms held her back. She cried out, begging her husband not to harm their child. But Agamemnon drowned out her words with prayer. Clytemnestra screamed as her daughter slumped to the ground. Then it began, quietly at first, but soon spreading from harbour end to harbour end, the ropes and rigging of 1,000 so long bucked against their stays. The wind was blowing again. With the death of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's fleet was free to depart for Troy. The war there would last for 10 long years. When victory finally came, the sack of the city was a bloody one. But some Trojans did survive. Among them was a prince called Aeneas. Although his wife died in the carnage, he managed to escape the burning city with his aged father and infant son. His story is told in the great epic poem, the Aeneid. It was written over a period of 10 years in the 1st century BC by the Roman poet Virgil. It is widely regarded as his masterpiece. As Aeneas' fleet sailed across the Mediterranean, it was beset by a devastating storm. Aeneas and his men were forced onto the shores of Africa. Its plains were veiled with cork oak and olive trees. Its hills, charred by the sun, seemed to lope eagerly towards the shade of distant mountains. It was on this harsh and arid coast that the city of Carthage was to be found. Aeneas and his men might have had a hostile welcome. Instead, the Carthaginians and their queen Dido took pity. For Carthage was a new settlement founded by refugees, just like the Trojans. In Aeneas, Dido saw a mirror of herself. She too had lost a spouse to violence. She too had been forced to flee her home.
Dido is a very competent, very capable. Virgil says, Femina dux facti, woman was the leader of the action. She's very positively presented as a leader.
Venus enchants Dido into falling in love with Aeneas to ensure that he gets a warm welcome and the supplies he needs. So it's kind of a mean trick. Poor Dido's just innocently extending sacred hospitality to a stranger, and Venus sort of creeps up behind her and fills her heart with passion.
Dido offered the Trojans not simply a place to recover after a storm, but a home as well. Cloaked in her kindness, however, was an act of hostility. Aeneas faced many foes on his journey to Italy, but love was to prove the most dangerous.
When Dido and Aeneas go off on a hunting party, the goddesses arrange a great big storm that is so bad that they have to take shelter, separated from the rest of the party in a cave. And they consummate their relationship to the sound of wolves howling, which is not really a very good omen.
Dido represented a threat not just to the onward progression of the story, but to the future of the world itself. For Carthage offered a viable alternative for Aeneas. Merging their families and people, he could have ruled the prosperous city by Dido's side. He could have been happy there. If he chose to stay, however, his people would never reach Italy. They would never found Rome. The history of the world, the Aeneid tells us, hinged on this moment.
What happens in the poem is that the god Mercury is sent to shake up Aeneas, to wake him up, remind him he's got a destiny he's meant to be fulfilling. So he comes down and he says to Aeneas, what are you doing? You're standing around on the walls of Carthage. You've got your own place to go and found. When Dido hears that he is going to leave, she confronts him and accuses him of planning to leave secretly. And he tells her that he's being torn by duty. He's not going of his own choice. This isn't his own free will. He's being forced to do this by the gods.
Dido was heartbroken. Aeneas had abandoned her for a future even he struggled to believe in. She was overcome with anguish. As Aeneas sailed away, she built a pyre in the center of her palace, climbed on top, and plunged a sword through her heart.
Sadly, I think that Aeneas leaving Dido is meant to be the key Roman moment in the entire epic. I think it's meant to imply the Roman male's ability to renounce sensuous pleasure and the appeal of everything that Carthage represents, which is kind of seductive, bad religion, naughty, immoral practices, in favor of the straight, linear Roman legion ideal.
It's also a triumph over sort of luxury and Orientalism and comfort. One of the things that Mercury criticises Aeneas for is wearing sort of a rich purple robe that Dido has given him.
I think it's meant to be a moment for drum beating and the sound of trumpets. The fact that it's also imbued with pathos is because Virgil's writing it, and Virgil really never writes anything without imbuing it with pathos. That's his thing. So he portrays Dido as this helpless, tragic victim, but it's not meant to make us think that Aeneas made the wrong choice.
From his ship, Aeneas saw the burning pyre and the walls of the palace aglow with its flames. He knew what it meant. Once again, he was leaving behind a city shrouded in smoke, torn apart by outsiders. However, this time, he was responsible. Dido would haunt him throughout the rest of the Aeneid. Her city, Carthage, would trouble Rome for centuries.
In Dido's dying words, she says she is rejoicing to travel to the underworld, and she hopes that Aeneas will see the pyre and that her death will be an omen, an omina for the Romans. Now, what this foreshadows is several centuries of conflict in between Rome and Carthage.
Rome and Carthage had, by Virgil's time, fought 3 very vicious wars called the Punic Wars. And Virgil is almost saying it's intrinsic to Rome to be opposed to Carthage because of this choice that Aeneas made.
Virgil lays bare love's destructive potential. It tempted Aeneas to forget his duty, and it transformed Dido from a wise, strong leader into a humiliated, savage creature. But there is a second transformation at work, one subtler and perhaps more subversive. Virgil was writing in the aftermath of a civil war. The assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC had led to a power vacuum at the heart of the Roman Republic. The struggle for supremacy would last more than a decade. In the end, it was Octavian, adopted son of Caesar, who triumphed. At the Battle of Actium, he defeated his one-time ally, Mark Antony. At Mark Antony's side to the end was his lover, Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. She was a figure of mockery, fear, and hatred in Rome. Virgil knew all this, so it is impossible to ignore the echoes of the African queen in his portrayal of Dido.
It would have resonated, particularly with Virgil's audience, which would have just lived through the Second Triumvirate Wars, which did very much involve the Antony-Cleopatra-Egyptian alliance.
There's very much a way that we can read the Dido-Aeneas episode as Aeneas teetering on an Antony-Cleopatra precipice and narrowly escaping the fate.
Cleopatra was seductive in some of the same ways as Dido. She's sort of oriental. That in itself is seductive. She comes from what can be understood as a foreign religion, a foreign culture. She's kind of magical in some of the same ways as Dido. So I think in all those respects, the figure of Dido could have been read by Virgil's original audiences as a kind of avatar of Cleopatra.
You might expect Dido, an enemy twice over, representing both Cleopatra and Carthage, to be vilified. Yet Virgil does not ask readers to hate her. Instead, he transforms her into the poem's most compelling character. He makes his audience feel Dido's rejection and the terrible pain she suffers. He makes us sympathize with the enemy. Love, Virgil tells us, can be a dangerous thing, but if it is, then it is one shared across divides of politics and nationhood. the eastern shores of the Black Sea, in the shadow of the Caucasus Mountains. This was the edge of the ancient Greek world. There was once a kingdom here, rich in iron and gold. Colchis was its name. This was the land which the Greek hero Jason came to on his quest for the Golden Fleece. An exiled prince, Jason needed the fleece to prove his worth and reclaim the throne that had been taken from him. But the fleece belonged to another man, King Aeneas, and he guarded it jealously. If Jason wanted the fleece, the king told him he would have to complete several challenges. Each seemed impossible, and would have been, but for the help of a young woman who had fallen deeply in love with the Greek hero, the daughter of King Aeneas himself, Medea.
Medea is perhaps one of the most fascinating characters in the whole of classical mythology.
She is generally regarded and described in the texts of all periods as a witch. That is, she's someone who has huge magical power.
When we first meet Medea, she's very much a traditional lovesick maiden, brimming with unrequited love and very modest and very nervous. But even at this stage, we start to see sort of a much darker, much more powerful figure starting to emerge.
With Medea's help, Jason completed the king's challenges. First, he had to harness fire-breathing bulls, then use them to plow a field. He had to sow serpents' teeth in the earth and kill the soldiers who miraculously grew from them. Finally, he had to overcome a sleepless dragon guarding the fleece itself. Such was her love for Jason that when the Greek hero left Colchis in triumph, Medea went with him. She would go on to bear his sons and travel by his side throughout the Greek world.
Having already stretched the mold of the helper maiden, Medea would challenge the constraints of her future roles as wife and mother, too. Any happiness Jason and Medea had would not last. When they reached Corinth, Jason abandoned Medea for the daughter of the king there.
But it was what she did next that secured her name in history. She destroyed the things dearest to her husband. Their children. Medea then fled Corinth and Jason for Athens. It was in that city that the story as we know it best today was written. Its author was the great playwright Euripides.
Euripides was the first one really to create characters who had a psychological reality, and that probably makes him more interesting to modern theatregoers than perhaps some of the others.
He also has a very light-hearted touch in that there is a surprising amount of black humour in Euripides. He really goes for that kind of dark irony and that bitterness that still somehow manages to be funny.
He's kind of free to create this wonderful, wonderful, not amoral character, but this character who's driven internally by her own idea of what ought to happen.
Euripides forces the audience into uncomfortable questions. As Medea veers from behavior we deem good to behavior we deem evil, we ask what it takes to go from one to the other. What drives humans to inhuman acts? And what might we be capable of in the wrong circumstances?
It's pretty terrifying because it's two passions opposing one another. The passion to get your own back at someone you loved and trusted who's betrayed you in the worst possible way, completely unfeelingly and unthinkingly, versus the maternal passion for your children, the longing to look after them and shelter them and nurture them and make sure no harm comes to them.
The Greeks were not necessarily keen on intense emotions. They felt that restraint was rather more important. So it would have seemed to them almost natural that this woman who was an outsider and a witch and obsessively in love should have fallen in on herself like this. So I think it's not a particularly positive attitude to the emotion of love.
Euripides' play was first performed in 413 BC. Every year, Athens held a festival dedicated to the god Dionysus. New plays were performed and judged. It was at this festival that Euripides presented his version of the Medea story. He came last.
We don't know what the audience reaction was, but there are several things that could have made an audience uneasy or less than happy about it.
One can assume that this would have been a very challenging play for them at the time, just as it remains a very challenging play for us. I mean, one cannot not be attracted to Medea, but then you stand back and you think, well, what has this woman done? So in a sense, she is attacking all of the institutions of kingship and marriage that were very central to the Greeks. She's destroying their sense of order, and order was really important in the Greek world.
Euripides' telling of the story has inspired writers and artists from every generation. And today, his tragedy is perhaps the most popular of all ancient Greek plays. It's the complexity of the lead character that drives this endless reinterpretation. Medea acts on emotion, but is also cunning. She's the wife of a Greek hero, but a foreign barbarian at the same time. She's a loving wife who defies her husband, a loving mother who murders her children. She's a woman who rejects the roles that male-dominated society has given her, even as she embodies them.
Medea's story tells us something very profound about ancient Greek attitudes to women, and particularly to the idea that women can't control their emotions as well as men can.
The Medea highlights the double standard. It's perfectly acceptable for Jason to decide he's going to abandon the woman who has left her country for him, had his children, go off and remarry sort of a young Corinthian princess, and Medea is supposed to just say, that's fine, dear, that's okay.
By living through her passions, as the play forces us to do, we're encouraged to think, in that situation, how could I restrain myself?
While this is obviously a very extreme case, it also establishes the idea of love as this dangerous driving force that can cause problems if it is not paid attention to.
After 10 years of war, the triumphant Agamemnon returned home from Troy. But his wife, Clytemnestra, had sworn an oath all those years ago. The daughter Agamemnon had sacrificed to reach Troy had not been forgotten. At last, there would be justice for Iphigenia. Love and violence seem bound together in Greek mythology. Just as in the tales of other cultures, it recognizes there are many sides to love. All these stories still speak to us, for the nature of this most powerful of emotions has not changed.
The reason that myths of love endure is that they tell us about human desires, and they tell us how perverse human desire is.
It's interesting that very often they aren't about love in the sense that we would recognize it. So they're not really like the romantic novels we're used to.
Human desire is typically not something under much rational control, and in myths, it often runs away with even the wariest and smartest heroes and queens and lures them into places where they'd really rather not be.
You have that question of where do you put love as this irrational, driving, powerful emotion within a structure of society, and what happens when it is scorned.
All societies must find a way of channeling this emotion, for its power over the human spirit is unrivaled. If at times it does inspire acts of horrifying violence, it is far more often responsible for kindness, self-sacrifice, and bravery. We cannot, however, have one without the other. Love is patient, love is kind, but love is also irrational, and love can be dangerous.
Tales have been told since man first gathered around the fires of prehistory. Tales of the strange and wondrous things hidden in the vast unknown shadows of the world. Tales of creatures divine and beasts demonic, of gods and kings, of myths and monsters. From dark forests to the lands of ice, from desert wastes to the storm-thrashed seas, every corner of the earth has its legends to tell. Stories of heroes and the villains they encounter, of the wilderness and the dangers within. Stories of battles, of love, of order, and of chaos. But what are the roots of these fantastic tales? And why have they endured so long?
In this series, we'll explore the history behind these legends and reveal the hidden influences that shaped them.
War and disease, religious and social upheaval, the untamable ferocity of the natural world.
And above all, the monsters lurking within ourselves.
For most of our existence on Earth, humans were hunter-gatherers. We foraged for survival, living on what we could scavenge, always on the move. All this changed around 10,000 years ago, when mankind formed its first permanent settlements. When we started growing crops and domesticating animals, the agricultural revolution had begun. The settlements grew, towns formed, then cities, nations, and empires. But it took more than living side by side to form a community. Shared traditions and beliefs were needed, and shared stories. It's through stories that the boundaries of a community were set, that their rules were tested, that they coped with change.
All societies going through periods of rapid change desperately need myths to hang on to. Sometimes myths seem to exist to question social norms and to ask us to question them. That's a much better way of enforcing social norms than the kind of story which just says, this is the social norm, this is what you're going to do.
I think if one sees it as a kind of vehicle in narrative form for things which are important in society, that's probably the best way of thinking of it.
So a lot of myths involve characters, heroes, heroines, debating what they should do, and in that way, a norm gets defined.
Myths, of course, can only become myths if we share them. We're a community of readers of the Bible. We share the faith in those stories. So myths create community, they bond us together.
Societies exist in a state of tension. The needs and wants of all can never be satisfied at the same time. A balance must be found. It's in the stories we tell each other that we debate what that balance is. The laws of the kingdom were clear, and Prince Roswal had broken them. He had disobeyed his father, the king. The three noblemen had been in the dungeon for years. They were blamed by the king for a crime they did not commit. Roswal was not his father, however. The injustice done to the three men shamed him. He had to do something. Roswal led the nobles out of the dungeon, past the guards, and through the secret, silent passages of the castle to freedom. But Roswal's father soon discovered who was responsible for the prisoner's escape. Roswal would pay a price for his kindness. The king banished his son, sending him forever into exile. The law, after all, was the law. It is a comforting thought that we have control over our destiny. The random cruelty of the world can seem at times too much to bear. Stories offer a haven. Good is rewarded, evil punished, and everyone gets their just deserts. In a story, even catastrophe has a reason. The rivers of central Germany carve through field and hill on their journey to the distant sea. For centuries, these waterways have borne goods and people up and down the country. Riverside towns grew rich on the back of this trade. One of their settlements was the town of Hamelin.
Hamelin was an important centre for the shipping of grain. It was on the Weser River. It got lots of grain coming in, it milled it, and it shipped it out. So it was one of the relatively new towns, which were becoming very, very important.
Much like all German towns of that age, it would have had a social structure. It would have had a class of Bürger, what we would call bourgeoisie, that is to say, qualified citizens of the town.
It would have been dominated by guilds rather than aristocrats. So one would begin to see the sort of structure that would eventually evolve into the modern city.
Hamelin is most famous, however, for the story of the Pied Piper. It's one of the best-known tales of the Brothers Grimm. In their telling, Hamelin was wealthy and thriving. Its citizens lived happily in their fine grey stone houses, until an infestation of rats inflicted misery on the town. This black swarm of vermin attacked barns and storehouses. They gnawed on wood and chewed through cloth. Try as they might, the people could not rid themselves of the plague. Salvation seemed to come in the figure of a mysterious piper. He lured the rats into the river with a magical song. But when the town refused to pay him what was promised, the piper swore revenge. Returning to the town, he played his song once more. But this time, it was the town's children he entranced. He marched them out of Hamelin and into a mountain cave. Neither piper nor children were ever seen again. There's more to it, however, than mere legend. In 1384, the Hamelin Chronicle recorded that a century had passed since the children had left the town. Something did happen in Hamelin. But what?
Because there's a specific date there's a suggestion that, well, maybe this started as a real story. And then you get the kind of speculation of what is going on.
I think we can say deductively, well, in all probability, it will have had its origin in some kind of social and cultural crisis. That's what the stories are there for. They're there to resolve that crisis. What kind of crisis might that have been? Well, we don't know. We can speculate.
Some suggest that a disease or famine must have struck Hamelin. The piper was symbolic of the death which carried the town's children away. Others have linked the story to the dancing plagues of medieval Europe. This bizarre trend saw thousands of people dance together in a state of frenzy until collapsing from exhaustion. A more convincing theory is that the legend of the Pied Piper is a story of migration. The town's children were in fact citizens who left Hamelin en masse in the late 13th century. This was a time when recruiters travelled across Central Europe seeking settlers for land further east. They offered rewards for those willing to move. Thousands took up the offer.
In Eastern Europe, you had these huge empty tracts of land, and landowners would actually hire agents to go find people to come and farm the land. So this may actually be a story of immigration.
There are some names which contain the etymology of Hamelin, and it is possible that perhaps 100 or 150 of the youth of Hamelin wandered away, and that the tale therefore has its origins in that great division of the population.
The Grimms recorded their version of the story in the 1800s, but the tale had been told and retold in Europe since the Middle Ages, and it evolved along the way.
Once you get people living in cities and they're crowded, you begin to see a change in the kind of stories they tell themselves or they tell each other. There are no rats in the original story. The idea of the bargain comes in even slightly later. Then by the time the 19th century comes along, you begin to get a much more sentimental thing, the little lame boy or the little blind boy, depending on the version, who can't keep up with his fellows. And therefore, the mountain closes before he can get there. So it's a wonderful example of how myths will change as society changes.
The story of the Pied Piper is one of social norms broken. Hamelin loses its children not to the random cruelty of sickness or war, but because of his own people's actions. They broke their agreement with the piper. Their greed and dishonesty are responsible for the disappearance of the children. In times scarred by war, starvation, and disease, the sense of control the story implies must have been comforting. Avoid Hamelin's mistake. Obey the rules of society, and catastrophe can be prevented. Prince Roswald did not go into his exile alone. He was accompanied by a steward who had served the family loyally for many years. After a long ride through punishing terrain, Roswald suggested they rest a while at a cooling stream. A sharp blow sent Roswald crashing unconscious to the ground. The steward sneered over him. Long had this man nursed resentment for his masters. Long had he cloaked his ambitions. Roswald's parents had given him gold enough to live in princely fashion. The wicked steward took it all. Donning Roswald's fine garments, the steward rode away with a prince's fortune and a prince's name. Poor Roswald was left for dead. Not all lawbreakers are as unpleasant as Roswald's treacherous steward. The good thief is an archetype found in cultures around the world. This rogue may break the laws of the land, but only to follow a higher code. In rebelling against the existing social order with all its flaws and inequalities, the good thief holds out the promise of something better. Amid the trees and woodland streams of the English forest, there once lurked a fugitive from the law. He was known by kings in their castles. He was beloved by peasants in the fields. He was a man of many identities. He was a trickster, a soldier, a rebel, a lord. His name was Robin Hood. Since emerging in the 14th century, Robin has become one of the world's most famous and enduring legends. Today, his story seems familiar to us all. Robin lives in the woods with his merry men. He challenges the wrongful authority of the Sheriff of Nottingham, and he robs from the rich to give to the poor. Yet this familiarity disguises the evolution of this legend. For as society has changed down the centuries, so has Robin Hood. For what defines wrongful authority? What principles justify rebellion against it? Our answers are always shifting. In the earliest ballads and plays about him, Robin is no knight fallen on hard times, nor a nobleman denied his birthright. Instead, he is a man of the people, a yeoman, a little more than a peasant.
The Robin Hood story is very much a story of ordinary people against authority. And Robin Hood is the nexus that allows authority to be challenged.
He's saying something about the ordinary person, the ordinary yeoman bowman, having capabilities that aren't well understood by toffs. Robin Hood is smarter and better at shooting and better at defending himself than the people who think they're very smart because they've got account books and because they're good with abacuses. And that, in a way, is the point of him. That's what he's for.
Stories about Robin were spread by word of mouth among ordinary people. And it was a time when they could do with a hero. The Black Death and other plagues had ravaged 14th century England. Civil war followed. Millions were killed or displaced. The stories of the defiant and clever Robin Hood offered rare victories for the common man. But he would not be theirs alone for long. In 1510, King Henry VIII himself played the outlaw at a court pageant. Even the high and mighty could not resist Robin's appeal. In the 16th century, England became a Protestant nation. As the country changed, so did the stories of Robin Hood. Soon it was not only the Sheriff of Nottingham he fought, but corrupt Catholic priests as well. Under Elizabeth I, however, authorities grew concerned. This legendary man of the people was becoming too popular. Robin Hood, they decided, was a threat to their power. Efforts were made to suppress the stories. If Robin Hood was to survive, he would have to change yet again. His savior was Elizabethan playwright Anthony Munday. He transformed the outlaw from a yeoman into the Earl of Huntingdon, a fallen member of the aristocracy. This changed the target of Robin Hood's rebellion. In Munday's telling, the outlaw's conflict was only with corrupt authority. Now, a member of the aristocracy himself and a loyal servant of the true king, Robin became a representative of legitimate authority. And every time he defied the rulers of his fictional world, he reinforced the social structures of the Elizabethan. The next great shift came in the 19th century.
The 19th century gets really keen on the medieval past. It's called medievalism. And this takes lots of different forms, like William Morris goes around trying to replicate medieval interiors and the look of medieval books, for example. You've got Tennyson writing poems about King Arthur, Idylls of the King and the Morte d'Arthur. And Robin Hood's sort of part of that. People like Walter Scott rewrite the legend to bring it into line with the 19th century's idea of what the Middle Ages were.
Robin becomes a literary figure, a popular figure. And once that happens, you get this romantic Robin Hood, who is very much loved by all. He's loved by women. He's very, very charming. He's loved by good men. He's a true monarchist, which is very important in the expanding English empire.
It was a time of urbanization, industry, and empire building. Its Robin Hood stories mingled nostalgia for a simpler medieval age with a muscular Victorian nationalism. The 19th century saw the popularity of the Robin Hood legend spread far beyond England, and in the 20th century he would reach Hollywood. Since his early appearances in silent film, there have been dozens of screen adventures for Robin Hood. These depictions vary decade by decade, but they always question pressing issues of the day. In the 1920s, it was American isolationism. In the 30s, the Depression and Roosevelt's New Deal. In the 1950s, Britain's post-war reconstruction was the unspoken backdrop. In the 1970s, its tired decline. The 90s saw a new, more international Robin Hood with allies of different races and creeds. And we continue year after year to revisit the story and recraft it for our own age. For the appeal of Robin Hood seems undimmed by time.
There's something immensely attractive about being an outlaw in connection with trees. I think it's just the idea of living in a world where you don't have to work, but where you have all kinds of important skills, and you're living in this kind of almost Edenic nature.
We like bad boys, and I think this is what the Robin Hood legend sort of attracts us to, in that he's a bad boy with a heart of gold. So there's something very, very attractive about him.
His identity, his enemies, and the questions he asks of us continue to evolve with every new screen adventure. Robin Hood is both a figure of comforting permanent tradition and a relentlessly contemporary rule-breaker. This dual identity is at the heart of his endurance. It is through constant evolution that Robin Hood maintains his foothold in our imagination. After weeks of wandering, the exhausted Roswell came to a city. Behind walls high and true stood great houses of stone, and beyond them, in the heart of the city, the towers of a mighty fortress dazzled in the sun. Roswell marveled at its wide streets and busy markets, but the greatest wonder was still to come. It was in the palace yard he saw her. He was transfixed. She was the most beautiful creature he had ever seen. Roswell summoned up his courage to speak with her. But before they had exchanged more than a few words, a harsh cry came from the palace. "Princess Lillian, come at once. Your father wishes to speak with you." Reluctantly, the princess obeyed. Roswell stared longingly after her. "She's not meant for the likes of us, lad," the passerby mocked. "She's to marry some fine prince, I hear." Sure enough, just days later, the prince promised to Lillian arrived at the castle. Roswell joined the crowds at the gate, but when he saw the prince, he was stunned. It was none other than the treacherous steward who had stolen his fortune and his princely name. He was the man dear Lillian was to wed. Sudden reversals in fortune, like those of Paul Roswell, are difficult for individuals to bear. Whole societies can fare little better. Balancing people's competing demands is difficult at the best of times. A sudden shock can make it impossible. One such shock came in the 16th century. In 1517, German monk Martin Luther defied the teachings of the Catholic Church. He ignited a religious revolution. The Reformation had begun. Soon, Europe was divided as never before. Families, communities, and nations were split, Catholic and Protestant. Wars of religion scarred the continent, and the bloodiest of all was the 30 Years' War. With almost 8 million casualties, the conflict was one of the longest and most destructive in European history. It began in the Holy Roman Empire, a fragmented land of tiny kingdoms and principalities.
All of these little kingdoms were caught up in a stupendous war about whether Catholics or Protestants should succeed to one of these little kingdoms. But all of them ended up getting involved, and it started in 1618, and it just banged on and on and on.
This was the epoch of the war which proverbially laid waste to Germany. Germany was the theatre of war for all of Europe.
The pretty normal experience was for the other side to ride into your village and just kill everybody, and I really mean everybody. That kind of nightmare experience became quite commonplace and must have altered people's sense of the world.
Caught up in this conflict was the North Bavarian town of Bamberg. It was a town built at the meeting of two rivers, 40 miles downstream from Nuremberg. It had grown in the shadow of a mountain fortress, but at its heart was the church. A 4-towered cathedral loomed over the rooftops, and Catholicism dominated everyday life.
Bamberg in the early 17th century was a typically South German, typically Bavarian place. It would have had a strongly established Roman Catholic culture.
Bamberg was a prince-archbishopric presided over by successive archbishops who strongly wanted to oppose the spread of Protestantism.
It defined itself over against the newly established and threatening Protestant culture just a few leagues up the road.
In 1623, Johann Georg von Dornheim became the city's prince-bishop. Von Dornheim was a Jesuit. He was utterly committed to the Catholic Church and obsessed with pushing back Protestantism.
The bishop was a rather extreme character, even by the standards of his day. He appears to have exploited his office as Prince Bishop of Bamberg to apply the most rigoristic form of witch hunting.
Witch hunts were not new in Bamberg. They had taken place under several of von Dornheim's predecessors. But von Dornheim took the practice to extremes. Not for nothing was he dubbed Der Hexenbrenner, the witch burner. Hundreds were accused, put on trial, and executed. In 1627, von Dornheim ordered the construction of the Witch House. This special prison had 28 cells and torture chambers. It was here he secured his confessions.
There was quite lavish torture used to force a confession from witches. And we know this because one of the suspects actually smuggled the letter out to his daughter. It's incredibly sad, explaining what had been done to him, explaining why he'd had to name names and betray people, even though he knew what he was saying wasn't true. And it was the standard array of medieval tortures: thumb screws, the boots, and the strappado, which mostly rely not only on pain, but on creating disfigurement and disability.
Neither age nor rank proved a defense against accusation. Among those executed were the mayor and his wife. Georg Hahn, a prominent doctor in the town, opposed the trials, but that only made him a target for the bishop. Hahn, his wife, his son, and 2 daughters were all burned at the stake. Witches have featured in European mythology and folklore for thousands of years, but they were never confined to the safe world of the story. Many believed in sorcery and blamed it for misfortune in their everyday life.
There has never been a society that didn't have at least a residual belief in witchcraft. It's not a recent thing. It doesn't suddenly bound into existence in the 17th century. What happens, though, and this is important, in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, people started trying to prosecute everyone who they thought was guilty of witchcraft. And by the time of the Bamberg trials, it was a serious matter for the secular courts, with capital punishment to follow.
The theological and legal foundation for witch trials was found in a book published in the late 15th century. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of the Witches, defined witchcraft as a pact with the devil and laid down ways to combat this alleged evil. The prosecution of witches was not restricted to Germany, however. Similar trials took place throughout Europe. Both Protestant and Catholic communities took part. In a tiny village in Sweden, more than 70 people were beheaded in a single day. Hundreds were killed in Scotland, and the Spanish Inquisition accused thousands. A moral panic was gripping Europe. But what could drive whole societies to such inhuman acts? For hundreds of years in the Middle Ages, Europe benefited from long summers and mild winters. Crops were plentiful, and the seas free of ice. But this medieval warm period did not last forever. By the 16th century, Europe had become colder. Rivers froze, snows lingered long into spring, and crops failed again and again.
There was widespread famine. Months of rain ruined crops, and there were no charitable agencies, of course, to prevent people starving in their villages.
What people thought they knew about the weather was constantly violated, and that upset them terribly and made them feel that something was causing all this. People are very reluctant to believe that nature is as changeable as it actually is.
If your harvest fails for 1 year, but then another year, and then another year, these things appear to be against the course of nature. Because they appear to be unnatural, of course, it's natural for the collective mind to seek a supernatural reason for it. It's that kind of collective thinking which surely would have played a significant role in the collective fury of the witch hunts.
The Bamberg trials finally ended after the Swedish intervention in the 30 Years' War.
King Gustavus Adolphus invaded Germany in defense of Protestantism. In February of 1632, his forces neared Bamberg. The Bishop von Dornheim fled. The remaining prisoners in the witch house were released. They were told never to speak of the torture inflicted upon them.
The trials in Bamberg are a frightening example of what can happen when society turns on itself, when it seeks out the saboteurs and the enemies within, when it embarks on a witch hunt.
In the 19th century, Britain was transformed. A steam-powered revolution was underway. Railways cut through the countryside. Chimneys pierced the sky. The roar of metal-toothed machinery filled the air, and black smoke veiled the heavens. The Industrial Revolution made Britain a global superpower. It reshaped the landscape of the country, and it altered the lives of its people forever.
Although creating great wealth and beginning to improve living standards of even the poorest, this new age of industry was also disrupting established ways of life. Old jobs were disappearing and towns were swallowing up people in their thousands.
The cities were transformed by factories and mills. They became dark and dirty. People started doing what we would now think of as a really long workday, actually. They typically were roused by the factory siren at sort of 7 in the morning and didn't stagger home again till 6 at night.
When you get new communities, you really have to create myths and legends that allow people to deal with that environment and allow people to identify themselves with that environment.
Once you've got people living in the rookeries, they're going to start trying to make up stories about where they are, and they're going to start trying to incorporate this nightmare landscape of thick smoke and fog and blackened buildings and hungry children into their mythology as a way of coping with it.
There aren't the certainties of the old small communities where everybody knew everybody. So the Industrial Revolution was a great sort of upset to old communities, but it also created new communities. And it's the transition between the old and new communities where you get a lot of new legends and myths starting to emerge.
The first rumors began circulating in the autumn of 1837. In the villages south of London, a monstrous fiend was on the loose. Described as a great white bull or bear, something had attacked several people, and women were its favorite target. As the rumors spread closer to the heart of the city, the strange creature's form shifted. It became more human and all the more frightening. It was an unearthly visitant, clad in armor and long-clawed gloves, who struck at night before escaping with great leaps over the city rooftops.
By early 1838, authorities could no longer ignore the phenomenon. On the 8th of January, Sir John Cowen, Lord Mayor of the City of London, publicised a letter he'd received from a resident of South London. The letter warned of the strange apparition and the terror growing among the people. The Lord Mayor, however, was dismissive. These attacks were either made up or the work of malicious pranksters.
The Times printed the mayor's announcement the next day. The monster made another leap, this time into the imaginations of people around the country. He soon had a name as well: Spring-Heeled Jack.
This is where you really see the media beginning to take the legend and feed back into the legend. terrible event in somewhere, great outrage in, I mean, you know, the usual things. But you also had a lot of chapbooks, which are sort of little, almost like little paperbacks, little sort of paper books, which were sold by peddlers all over the country.
It comes from the kind of literature that usually gets characterized as the penny dreadful, which is a literature deliberately produced for, and to some extent also by, the ordinary kids who are just about literate, who love a good story, who love to be scared.
The idea of something jumping at you is like a popcorn moment in a horror film, basically. And this is part of the thing that appealed to people. They like to be scared.
Spring Hill Jack was a blend of the old and new. He was a figure reminiscent of ancient superstition, yet was strikingly modern in his appearance. Whether the attacks were real or fabricated in many ways doesn't matter. The fact that the stories spread so quickly and were believed by so many reveals an anxiety at work in Victorian society. For with his metal claws and furnace mouth, Spring Hill Jack was the dark personification of this new industrial urban world, a new demon hidden among the anonymous masses of the city.
It must have seemed to people that they were living in hell. At night you could see the fires from the potteries for miles and miles and the smoke belching out. Why would you not think that this was part of a kind of modern demonology?
This notion of a character who can jump quickly, looks like the devil, sometimes he's skeletal, sometimes he's got fiery eyes, but he also begins to take on characters of the Gothic hero, in that he can be dressed as a gentleman and he has a long cloak. So you can see this figure being created about all of the fascinations and anxieties of the Victorian world.
I suspect Spring Hill Jack struck people as a kind of emanation of the Industrial Revolution itself, the darkness, the terrible smog and fog that overtook the country, the fact that even the trees turned black.
He's the perfect urban legend for the Victorian era. He's a criminal, he's supernatural. You never know when he's going to appear. He attacks the vulnerable. But of course, if you read about him in a chapbook or a newspaper or see him on stage, somehow you're safe.
Three days of jousting were announced to celebrate the nuptials of Princess Lillian. The crowd roared as the jousts began. But sitting in the royal box beside her husband-to-be, Lillian could not muster even a smile. Across the tourney field, the miserable Roswell paid little heed to the spectacle either. When the jousting came to an end, the victors paraded down the ground. The custom was for them to stop and bow at the royal box. But not this day. Instead, the three knights ignored the impostor prince and rode on towards the other side of the ground. There, among the common people, they found Roswell. It was to him they bowed. Roswell was stunned until the knights removed their helmets. They were the noblemen he had freed from his father's dungeon. They denounced the impostor in the royal box and proclaimed Roswell the true prince. "Arrest them!" the steward cried, but nobody moved. "Arrest them!" The more he shouted, the less princely he looked. Instead of the royal bride he hoped for, the steward received a traitor's death. His head was left to rot above the city gates. Reclaiming his royal title, Roswell married Lillian. The happy kingdom they inherited lived in peace and justice all the rest of their days. With roots in earlier folklore, the story of Roswell was a popular one in 16th century England and Scotland. It was a tale of social order uprooted and then restored. an attractive proposition for many in what was a time of religious upheaval and national uncertainty. For change is often frightening. Too much can tear society apart, but too little and society withers. In times of change, stories can be a comfort to cling to, or a tool to probe with. They can be a reminder of shared history, or a vision of a possible future. The best of them have lingered in our memory for centuries. The tensions in society reflected by those tales have not disappeared completely, however. We remain a jumble of contradictions just about muddling by. But as was ever the case, is in the stories we cherish, in the legends we believe, and in the myths we retell, that those contradictions are debated and our values are tested.
The Norman family just switched to unlimited from Sprint, and each gets $100 in free Pokemon Go Pokecoins. Now they're prepared
to capture even more Pokemon.
Go to your Sprint store and switch to get $100 in Pokecoins free and get unlimited for $25 per month for 4 lines.
I don't saw your face last night, hoping that could mean something. So I'll say nothing. Now I'm drowned in the bottle that I couldn't wake. Hoping that you'll come and save me again. I must be dreaming. gonna save me again. But I must be dreaming. But I've learned to take my dreaming.